You're in your apartment alone. Then you hear something. You think, was it just the storm? You realize you're not alone. Your living room is not safe with Unhinged, the new immersive game experience brought to you by Netflix. To make it out alive, you must answer the phone. The question is, when your phone rings, will you answer? Tap the banner to play Unhinged now, only on Netflix.
Few places have acquired a reputation to match that of Borley Rectory. For much of the 20th century, it was described as the most haunted house in England, a place where ghostly figures crossed the garden at dusk. Unseen hands rang servant bells, messages appeared upon the walls, and objects were said to move without human touch. Writers, journalists, psychical researchers, and curious visitors travelled from across Britain to see the rectory for themselves, while newspapers carried its stories far beyond the quiet Essex village where they first began. Even after the building had burned to the ground and its ruins were finally cleared away, people continued to visit the site, convinced that something of its strange reputation had survived. The story begins in North Essex, close to the Suffolk border, where the small village of Borley stands on rising ground above the valley of the River Stour. It is a peaceful landscape of narrow lanes, open fields and scattered farms, overlooked by the ancient church of St. Mary. Generations have worshipped there since the Norman period, while the surrounding countryside has changed remarkably little. Long before Borley became associated with ghosts, it was simply another rural parish whose history was shaped by farming, the church, and the quiet rhythm of village life. The rectory itself was built during 1862 and completed in 1863 by the Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, who had recently become rector of the parish. It was a substantial Victorian house of red brick, enlarged a few years later until it contained more than 20 rooms connected by several staircases. Around it stood stables, barns, workshops, and a rectory cottage, while orchards and gardens stretched towards the churchyard. Mature trees surrounded much of the property, and beyond them lay open farmland that rolled gently down towards the River Stour. It was an impressive family home rather than an ancient mansion, and despite the legends that later grew around it, there is no historical evidence that it stood upon the remains of a medieval monastery. Henry Bull and his wife raised 14 children there, making the rectory a busy household for decades. Visitors came and went, servants worked throughout the house and gardens, and parish life revolved around the rector and his family. Nothing in the surviving records from those early years suggests that the building was regarded as exceptional. If unusual things happened during its first years, they left little trace in contemporary documents. Stories only begin to emerge towards the end of the 19th century, and even then they are remarkably restrained. Servants later record hearing footsteps in empty passages during the night. A young nursemaid remembered lying awake after other servants had warned her that her bedroom was haunted, listening to someone walking softly along the corridor outside her door. She never opened the door to discover who or what had passed by. The account was not written until many years later, but it remains one of the earliest descriptions associated with the rectory. By then, the house had already acquired a local reputation. Former villagers later remembered hearing ghost stories while they were still children, long before Borley became known outside the surrounding countryside. None of these early accounts describe the spectacular disturbances that would later fill newspaper headlines. They belong instead to the older tradition of English ghost stories, unexplained footsteps, distant figures, and quiet experiences shared between neighbours rather than reported to the wider world. When Henry Bull died, the living passed to his son, the Reverend Harry Foyster Bull. The transition was seamless. The family remained in residence, and Borley Rectory continued to be both a family home and the centre of parish life. Harry Bull possessed a genuine interest in spiritual matters and was known to discuss unusual experiences quite openly. Friends later record conversations in which he spoke of apparitions seen within the grounds, while members of the family remembered him describing figures that appeared in the gardens after dusk. Not everyone accepted his conclusions. Some of his brothers later insisted that they had experienced nothing out of the ordinary, despite living in the same house for many years. One evening during the summer of 1900, 4 of the Bull sisters were walking in the garden when they noticed a solitary figure moving beneath the trees close to the churchyard path. They believed they were looking at a woman dressed in dark flowing robes. She appeared to be walking slowly across the lawn without acknowledging their presence. The sisters called out to her, expecting some response, but none came. Before long, the figure disappeared among the trees. That single account would eventually become one of the most famous ghost stories in Britain. For the Bull family, the appearance of the dark figure did not become an isolated incident. During the years that followed, other members of the household claimed to catch occasional glimpses of someone moving through the grounds, usually near the path that ran beside the churchyard. The descriptions were never entirely consistent. Sometimes the figure appeared to be dressed in black, sometimes merely in dark clothing, and it was almost always seen at a distance. Later writers would describe the apparition as a nun, but the earliest recollections are noticeably less certain. Ethel Bull herself later said only that she had seen a woman in a long dark robe, bent slightly forwards as she walked. She could never describe the face. Harry Bull believed the gardens were visited by more than one apparition. Friends later record him speaking of an elderly gardener known as Old Amos, a familiar figure whom he claimed to have recognised wandering through the grounds long after his death. There were also stories of a phantom coach travelling along the lane outside the rectory before disappearing from sight. Such accounts were never recorded at the time. They were said to have occurred and survive only through later recollections, making them difficult to examine in detail. But they formed an important part of the rectory's growing folklore long before newspapers took any interest in the village. One story became especially well known after Harry Price included it in his books. Harry Bull was said to have been walking through the garden with his retriever, Juvenile, when the dog suddenly stopped, growled, and became visibly uneasy. Looking ahead, Bull noticed what appeared to be the legs of a man behind a line of fruit trees. Believing he had disturbed a poacher, he followed with the dog towards a small gate leading into the garden. By the time he had reached it, the figure had disappeared. Later versions of the story transformed the unknown figure into a headless man. The original notes taken by Harry Price during his first visit to Borley tell a rather different story. They record only that Harry Bull saw a man's legs beyond the trees, assumed the stranger was a poacher, and watched him disappear through the gate. The description of a headless apparition appears only in later published accounts, when it is one of several examples where the printed version became more dramatic than the earliest surviving notes. By the beginning of the 20th century, Borley Rectory had become known locally as a house with strange stories attached to it. Visitors occasionally heard them, neighbouring villagers repeated them, and servants passed them on to newcomers joining the household. Even so, they remained exactly that, local stories. Outside the villages surrounding Borley, almost nobody had heard of the rectory or the figures that were said to wander through its gardens. There were no newspaper reporters waiting outside the gates, no organised investigations, and no crowds of curious visitors. The legends still belonged almost entirely to the people who lived nearby. Harry Bull remained rector until his death in the summer of 1927. For a short time, the rectory stood empty, its windows looking across the same lawns where the Bull sisters had reported their mysterious visitor nearly 30 years earlier. When a new rector finally arrived the following year, he inherited more than a Victorian house. Without fully realising it, he also inherited decades of whispered stories that had never travelled much beyond the fields of North Essex. The man who arrived at Borley in October 1928 was the Reverend Guy Eric Smith. Unlike the Bull family, he came to the parish with no personal connection to the village or its stories. Before entering the Church of England, he had spent many years working for the Indian government, eventually leaving a secure career to train for the ministry. He and his wife, Mabel, expected to find the usual challenges of life in a large country rectory. Instead, they found themselves living in a house whose reputation had already begun to unsettle those around it. Soon after their arrival, neighbours mentioned the stories attached to the rectory. The Smiths also heard them from local people who spoke of strange figures in the garden and unexplained happenings within the house. At first, they appear to have regarded these tales, much as anyone new to the old village might have done. Every community has its traditions, and many old houses gather stories as the years pass. Borley seemed no different.
This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
Before long, however, the Smiths began reporting incidents of their own. They described hearing footsteps when nobody else appeared to be in the house, and spoke of odd noises that they struggled to explain. Their maid, Mary Pearson, also claimed to have witnessed unusual figures about the property. Unlike the stories from the Bull years, these experiences were no longer confined to conversations between neighbours. The new rector decided to seek advice. Rather than approaching the Society for Psychical Research directly, the Smiths contacted the Daily Mirror. It was an unusual decision, but one that would alter the history of Borley forever. The newspaper immediately recognised the appeal of an apparently haunted Victorian rectory, occupied by a serving clergyman, and within days, reporter V.C. Wall was on his way to Essex. Wall also contacted one of Britain's best-known investigators of psychic claims, Harry Price. By 1929, Price was already a familiar public figure. He had investigated mediums, seances, and alleged hauntings for many years, and possessed an instinctive understanding of newspaper publicity. He knew how to capture public imagination, but he also believed that unusual claims deserved investigation. His arrival at Borley on the 12th of June 1929 marked the beginning of the period for which the rectory would become famous. The timing could hardly have been more dramatic. According to the accounts published afterwards, objects were thrown inside the house while Price was present. Small stones appeared indoors. Bottles and other items were said to move unexpectedly, and messages were reportedly tapped out on a mirror. Price later regarded these incidents as some of the strongest evidence that Borley was genuinely haunted, recording them in detail in his books. Not everyone who accompanied him reached the same conclusion. Among those present was journalist Charles Sutton, who many years later publicly accused Harry Price of producing some of the disturbances himself. Cynthia Ledsham, who would later accompany Price during his excavations of the ruined rectory, also accused him of staging at least one famous incident. Lord Charles Hope, another experienced investigator who visited Borley during this period, eventually concluded that Price had seriously damaged the credibility of their case. Their criticisms would not emerge until much later, but they would become central to the long-running debate over what really happened at Borley. At the time, however, none of that was known outside the small group gathered inside the rectory. Newspaper readers simply encountered a remarkable story. Here was an Essex rectory, where stones appeared to fly through the rooms. Servants claimed to see ghostly figures, and one of Britain's best-known psychical researchers had arrived to investigate. Within a matter of days, Borley had ceased to be a local curiosity. It had become a national sensation. The sudden publicity proved overwhelming for the Smiths. Curious visitors began arriving in the village, eager to catch a glimpse of the famous haunted house. The rectory itself lacked many of the comforts expected of a modern home, and the constant attention made ordinary parish life increasingly difficult. Barely 9 months after arriving, Guy and Mabel Smith left the rectory and moved to nearby Long Melford, continuing to serve the parish from there until another rector could be appointed. For a brief period, the strange events seemed to subside. Then, in the autumn of 1930, a new family crossed the threshold of Borley Rectory. What followed would overshadow everything that had gone on before and establish the house as the most discussed haunting in Britain. The new rector was the Reverend Lionel Algernon Foyster, a cousin of the Bull family. Unlike his predecessor, Lionel already knew something of Borley's reputation before accepting the living. He had spent years working as a missionary in Canada before returning to England, and by the time he arrived in Essex, he was suffering badly from rheumatoid arthritis. The disease had begun to restrict his movement and would steadily worsen during the years that followed. Despite his failing health, he remained devoted to his parish and moved into the rectory with his wife, Marianne, and their young adopted daughter, Adelaide. The contrast between Lionel and Marianne was immediately apparent to those who met them. Lionel was quiet, thoughtful, and deeply committed to his ministry. Marianne possessed a far stronger personality. She was intelligent, independent, and considerably younger than her husband. Friends and neighbours later described her as lively and energetic, qualities that stood in marked contrast to Lionel's increasingly fragile health. Their marriage would become one of the most closely examined aspects of the Borley story, though much of what has since been written owes more to speculation than to evidence. Within weeks of the family's arrival, Lionel began recording incidents that he believed could not easily be explained. Unlike many of the earlier stories connected with the rectory, these accounts were written down at the time. He kept careful notes, later producing a detailed memorandum describing the events that had disturbed the household. Whether every incident occurred exactly as recorded remains open to debate, but the document itself survives and provides one of the most valuable contemporary sources in the entire Borley case. The first occurrences were relatively modest. Bells connected to the servants' call system rang without anyone apparently touching them. Footsteps were heard moving through parts of the house where nobody could be found. Doors were reported to open unexpectedly, while objects occasionally appeared in places where they had not been left. None of these incidents, taken individually, would have attracted much attention, but large Victorian houses often produced unexplained noises, and faulty bell systems were far from uncommon. What concerned the Foysters was the apparent frequency in which these events were beginning to occur. Visitors soon found themselves witnessing incidents of their own. Sir George Whitehouse, the church warden, and his wife became regular callers at the rectory and spent many evenings with the family. Their nephew, Edwin Whitehouse, also became deeply involved, invalided from the Royal Navy after the First World War and carrying the psychological scars of his wartime experiences. Edwin developed a strong interest in psychical research and was fascinated by the strange reports emerging from Borley. Over time, he became one of the most frequent visitors to the rectory and one of the principal witnesses to the events described there. As the months passed, the reports became increasingly dramatic. Bottles were said to fall from shelves without warning. Small objects were discovered in unexpected places. Stones appeared inside rooms where doors and windows had been closed. On several occasions, Lionel described hearing loud crashes everywhere in the house, only to find nothing disturbed when he investigated. Some visitors experienced these incidents for themselves, while others spent entire evenings at the rectory without witnessing anything unusual at all. One feature of the disturbances became quickly impossible to ignore. Much of the activity seemed to centre upon Marianne. She was often present when objects moved or when the bell system erupted into sudden ringing. Later investigators would point to this pattern as typical of many reported poltergeist cases, where unexplained physical disturbances appear to cluster around a particular individual. Others reached a very different conclusion, suggesting that Marianne herself might have been responsible for at least some of the incidents. The disagreement would continue long after the rectory had disappeared. Among the many reports from the Foyster years, none became more closely associated with Borley than the mysterious writings that began appearing on the walls. They were found in several parts of the rectory, usually written in pencil upon the painted plaster. Some consisted of little more than names or rough marks. Others appeared to be desperate appeals for help. The best known carried phrases such as, "Marianne, please help get," and light mass prayers. Their uncertain grammar and hurried appearance only added to their reputation. The writings attracted immediate attention because no one claimed to have seen them being produced. They seemed simply to appear between one visit to a room and the next. Harry Price later reproduced many of them in his books, presenting them as among the strongest evidence that some unseen intelligence was attempting to communicate with the living. Not everyone accepted that conclusion. Several years later, members of the Society for Psychical Research examined both the surviving photographs and the circumstances in which the messages appeared. They concluded that there was no convincing evidence that the writings had been produced paranormally. More than one investigator became convinced that Marianne Foster had written at least some of them herself. Their conclusion rested not upon a single piece of evidence, but upon the circumstances surrounding the messages, their wording, and the opportunities available within the household. Even so, no one ever witnessed Marianne writing them, and the question has remained one of the most disputed aspects of the Borley story. The bell system continued to cause just as much discussion. Like many large Victorian houses, the rectory still possessed a network of servants' bells, connected by wires running through walls and ceilings. Individual rooms were linked to different bells, allowing members of the household to summon servants. According to Lionel Foister, these bells sometimes rang without warning, occasionally several together. Visitors also reported hearing them, and they soon became one of the defining features of the haunting. Later investigation showed that the system was old, complicated, and far from reliable. Some researchers believed that occasional ringing could be explained by mechanical faults, movement within the wires, or ordinary wear. Simultaneous ringing of several bells was much harder to account for naturally, although later writers suggest that deliberate interference could not be ruled out. One of Marianne's adopted sons would eventually describe discovering a simple method by which several bells could be operated together, a revelation that inevitably cast fresh doubt upon at least some of the more spectacular accounts. Objects continued to be reported moving within the house. Small stones were found indoors. Glasses and bottles were said to fall unexpectedly. On one occasion, a heavy vase was reported to have smashed onto the floor. At other times, books were discovered lying in different rooms from where they had been left. Some incidents were witnessed by several people, while others rested entirely upon the testimony of a single observer. Lionel recorded them carefully in his memorandum without attempting to explain how they had occurred. The disturbances also appeared to fluctuate. There were periods when almost nothing unusual happened, followed by days during which incidents were reported one after another. Friends visiting the rectory sometimes experienced nothing at all, while others happened to arrive during periods when bells rang, objects fell, or loud crashes echoed through the building. This inconsistency became one of the defining characteristics of the Borley case, and made systematic investigation extremely difficult. As news of the disturbances spread, increasing numbers of visitors found reasons to call at the rectory. Some arrived out of genuine concern for the Foisters. Others came hoping to witness evidence of the supernatural. A few brought with them firm spiritualist beliefs and were already convinced that unseen forces were at work before they crossed the threshold. The house became a meeting place for clergymen, neighbours, investigators, mediums, and curious friends, each leaving with their own impression of what they believed they had experienced. As the disturbances continued, advice arrived from several directions. Friends suggested prayer, while others recommended that the house should be investigated by people experienced in psychic phenomena. Spiritualism enjoyed enormous popularity during the years between the First and Second World Wars. Thousands of families, still grieving for those lost in the Great War, attended seances in the hope of making contact with the dead. Borley's reputation naturally attracted the attention of local spiritualist groups, many of whom believed that whatever troubled the rectory could be identified and removed. One of the best-known visits took place when members of the Marks Tay spiritualist circle travelled to Borley, accompanied by the medium Guy Lestrange. Lestrange was an unusual figure, a successful businessman from Great Yarmouth. He had developed a reputation as a spiritualist medium and was convinced that the disturbances at Borley were the work of restless spirits. During a series of sittings, messages were allegedly received, identifying various entities believed to be responsible for the activity within the household. Among the names that emerged was Joe Miles, who was later described as the source of the disturbances. Later communications introduced another spirit, Evangeline Westcott, who was said to have displaced him. These names would eventually disappear from the Borley story altogether, overshadowed by later seances that introduced an entirely different character into the legend. At the time, however, the participants accepted the communications seriously and believed they had identified the unseen forces affecting the rectory. The group carried out prayers and what they regarded as a form of spiritual cleansing. Unlike the formal rites of exorcism performed within the Church of England, these proceedings reflected the beliefs of contemporary spiritualism, combining prayer with attempts to communicate directly with the supposed spirits themselves. Accounts differ over exactly what took place during those meetings, but there is a broad agreement about what followed. Almost immediately afterwards, the reported disturbances diminished dramatically. Lionel Foister later wrote that, apart from a handful of isolated incidents, the violent activity ceased. Whether this change resulted from the visit itself, from changing circumstances within the household, or from causes entirely unrelated to the seance, has never been established. The timing was certainly remarkable, and it became one of the principal arguments used by believers that the rectory had genuinely been freed from whatever had troubled it. Life at Borley nevertheless remained difficult. Lionel's health continued to decline as rheumatoid arthritis gradually restricted almost every movement. By the early 1930s, he required increasing assistance with even ordinary daily tasks. Herbert Mays, the gardener and handyman employed at the rectory, later record helping the rector to bed when he was no longer able to manage the stairs unaided. Friends who visited the house remembered a man determined to continue his ministry despite constant pain. Marianne's own life was becoming increasingly complicated. During these years, she formed a relationship with Frank Peerless, a handyman and lodger who had become attached to the household. Peerless was an energetic but deeply unreliable character who lived under various names during his lifetime and left behind a trail of failed relationships, deception, and financial difficulties. Later research established that he and Marianne conducted an affair while Lionel was still living at the rectory, a fact unknown to many of those investigating the haunting at the time. The discovery of that relationship transformed later attempts to understand the Borley case. Trevor Hall and other researchers came to regard Peerless as one of the most important figures in the entire country. He enjoyed unrestricted access to the house, possessed ample opportunity to move unnoticed through its rooms, and, unlike most of the witnesses, was never properly interviewed while the events were still fresh. By the time his significance became clear, many years had passed and the opportunity had been lost. In October 1935, after 5 difficult years, Lionel and Marianne Foister eventually left Borley Rectory. Lionel's health made it impossible for him to continue living in such a large and isolated house, and the family moved away from the parish. Looking back, the Foister years had produced by far the greatest number of reported disturbances ever associated with the rectory. Bells, wall writings, moving objects, and unexplained noises had all become part of the growing legend. None of these stories, however, had yet secured Borley's place in history. That would happen only after the house stood empty, when Harry Price returned with an idea that no psychical researcher had attempted before. He would rent the rectory itself and invite dozens of independent observers to spend the night in what the newspapers were already calling the most haunted house in England.
Here's your report.
Oh, thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire someone just like you.
Try LinkedIn Hiring Pro. It's more than a job board. It's like the recruiter you always wished you had. Hiring Pro uses real-time insights to match your role to LinkedIn's unique network of professionals and delivers a short list of best fit candidates. You'll spend less time sorting applicants and more time talking to the right people.
Let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
When the Foysters left Borley, the rectory once again fell silent. No family moved in to replace them. The building was already regarded as inconvenient by modern standards. It was large, expensive to maintain, and lacked many of the comforts expected by a country clergyman during the 1930s. The new rector, the Reverend A.C. Henning, obtained permission to live elsewhere, leaving the old rectory standing empty beside the church. Its reputation, however, was anything but dormant. Stories continued to circulate among local people, while newspaper reports ensured that Borley's name was becoming familiar throughout Britain. Visitors still found their way to the village, hoping to catch sight of the famous house, and ghost hunters regarded the empty rectory as one of the most intriguing places in the country. The building itself had changed very little, but public perception had changed enormously. During little more than half a dozen years, Borley had become more than a village ghost story. It had become a national legend. No individual was more closely associated with that transformation than Harry Price. Born in London in 1881, Price had developed an interest in conjuring while still a boy. That fascination gradually widened into an interest in psychic phenomena, spiritualism, and the investigation of mediums. Unlike many investigators of his generation, he understood the methods used by professional magicians and illusionists, knowledge that proved invaluable when examining fraudulent seances. During the 1920s, he exposed a number of celebrated mediums, earning both admiration and bitter enemies within the spiritualist circles. By the time Borley entered his life, he was already one of Britain's best-known psychical researchers. Price possessed an unusual combination of qualities. He was energetic, persuasive, and an exceptionally gifted publicist. He understood newspapers almost instinctively and recognized the value of a compelling story. At the same time, he genuinely believed that some psychic phenomena deserved serious investigation. Those two sides of his character would exist in uneasy partnership throughout the Borley affair. The years that followed have made Harry Price one of the most controversial figures in the history of psychical research. Admirers regarded him as a pioneer who introduced scientific methods into the investigation of hauntings and exposed countless fraudulent mediums. Critics accused him of exaggeration, careless reporting, and in some instances, manufacturing evidence that supported his conclusions. Few investigators have inspired such sharply divided opinions. Even those who later challenged almost every aspect of his work acknowledged his remarkable ability to capture public imagination. Without Harry Price, Borley would almost certainly have remained a curious village ghost story, remembered mainly in North Essex. With him, it became known throughout the English-speaking world. In the spring of 1937, nearly 6 years after his last visit, Price returned to the empty rectory. This time, he arrived with an ambitious plan. Rather than spending a few days investigating reports from other witnesses, he intended to rent the building for an entire year and organise what he believed would become the most extensive investigation of a haunted house ever attempted. It was an idea unlike anything that had gone before. Price took possession of the rectory during May 1937. Rather than living there continuously himself, he organised an ambitious rota of volunteer observers who would spend weekends inside the building, recording anything they saw or heard. An advertisement placed in the Times invited responsible men and women to assist what was presented as a serious scientific investigation. Applicants were expected to be intelligent, observant, and prepared to spend long hours and sometimes entire nights inside an empty house already famous throughout Britain. In the months that followed, almost 50 observers passed through Borley Rectory. They arrived from a wide variety of backgrounds. Some possessed scientific training, others had experience of psychical research, while many simply accepted Price's invitation out of curiosity. Among the most active were Sidney Glanville and his son Roger, and Mark Kerr Pierce, all of whom would become closely associated with the investigation. They were supplied with instructions describing the kinds of phenomena previously reported within the rectory, and were asked to keep careful notes of anything unusual they experienced. The house they entered was already beginning to deteriorate. Dust gathered in rooms that had once been occupied by the Foysters. Furniture stood abandoned where it had last been used, and the silence of an empty country rectory settled over the building. Outside, the gardens had become increasingly neglected. The orchards remained, the lawns stretched towards the churchyard, as they always had, and the two summer houses still stood amongst the trees. After sunset, the house became a very different place from the lively family home it had once been. Many observers reported nothing unusual at all. Several later admitted that despite spending entire nights in the rectory, they heard only the ordinary sounds expected in an old country house. Wind moved through chimneys and beneath doors. Timber contracted as temperatures fell after sunset. Rats and mice were occasionally heard moving within the walls and roof spaces, while owls and other wildlife could easily be mistaken for unfamiliar noises by those listening intently in the darkness. Others became aware of something altogether stranger. Some described hearing footsteps crossing empty rooms overhead. Others reported gentle tapping sounds from distant parts of the house, or the unexplained ringing of bells connected to the old servant system. A handful claimed to see lights moving where no one appeared to be present, while several spoke of sudden drops in temperature within otherwise still rooms. Most of these incidents were witnessed by only one observer at a time, making them impossible to verify afterwards. But together they added steadily to the growing collection of experiences associated with the rectory. Not every observer accepted that the phenomena were paranormal. Mark Kerr Pierce noted that climbing roses brushing against the outside walls could produce sharp knocking sounds, remarkably similar to those often attributed to ghosts. Another observer from University College in Oxford noticed bushes repeatedly striking windows in the wind, and suggested they could account for some of the mysterious raps heard during the night. He also discovered that parts of the rectory could be entered far more easily than many people realised, raising the possibility that at least some incidents might have involved ordinary human interference. The building itself also possessed unusual acoustic properties. Sounds carried unpredictably through the enclosed courtyard and along the network of passages and staircases. Footsteps in the adjoining cottage could sometimes seem to originate within the rectory itself, while noises made outside were capable of echoing into unexpected parts of the house. Years later, Major Henry Douglas Home, one of the investigators familiar with Borley, concluded that these peculiar acoustics explained a surprising number of reports that had once appeared deeply mysterious. Price remained convinced that something genuinely unusual was taking place. The observers' reports continued to accumulate, filling notebooks and files with descriptions of knocks, movements, lights, and fleeting apparitions. To many readers, these records appeared impressive, simply because of their number. To later critics, however, the investigation suffered from a fundamental weakness. Every observer arrived knowing Borley's reputation before stepping through the front door. They had been told exactly what previous visitors claimed to have experienced, and many had already read newspaper accounts describing the rectory as the most haunted house in England. During these months, another development began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the London home of Sidney Glanville. It would introduce an entirely new chapter to the Borley story and create the legend that many people still associate with the rectory today. It began with a planchette board and the handwriting of Sidney Glanville's daughter, Helen. The séances that followed did not take place inside Borley Rectory. They were held at the Glanville family home in Streatham, where Helen Glanville experimented with a planchette for the first time. A planchette was a small wooden device fitted with wheels and a pencil, intended to record messages believed by spiritualists to originate from the spirit world. During a series of sittings in the autumn of 1937, the pencil began producing names, dates, and fragments of what appeared to be a story connected with Borley. At first, the messages were confused and incomplete. As more sittings took place, they became increasingly elaborate. They spoke of a young French woman named Marie, or Marie Lair, who was said to have travelled from a convent at Le Havre to England centuries before. According to the communications, she had fallen in love with a member of the Waldegrave family, been murdered and secretly buried beneath an earlier building that had once stood on the site of Borley Rectory. The story was unlike anything that had previously formed part of Borley's folklore. Until then, the best-known legend had spoken of a monk and a nun attempting to elope before meeting a tragic end. That tale itself had no historical foundation and rested entirely upon village tradition. The planchette communications replaced it with something altogether different. Named individuals, precise dates, and a burial beneath the rectory cellars. It was a far more detailed narrative than anything that had previously emerged from Borley. Harry Price embraced the new material with enthusiasm. The messages seemed to provide an explanation for many of the reports that had accumulated over the previous decade. The dark figure seen in the gardens, the mysterious writings on the walls, and several other incidents were gradually linked to the supposed spirit of Marie Lair. Later editions of Price's work gave this story a central place in the history of the haunting, and for many readers it became inseparable from Borley itself. Not everyone involved accepted the communications at face value. Sidney Glanville, despite being one of Price's closest collaborators, remained cautious about the claims emerging through his daughter's planchette. He was deeply interested in the investigation of Borley, but he expressed private doubts about relying too heavily upon automatic writing as evidence. Those reservations rarely appeared in the popular accounts of the haunting. Other names also emerged during the sittings. One communicator called itself unexplained and delivered a dramatic warning that the rectory would be destroyed by fire. The prediction attracted considerable attention because little more than a year later, the building really was consumed by flames. The timing has often been presented as remarkable, although the original prediction stated that the fire would occur the very next night. Nothing happened. Only after the rectory burned many months later did the earlier message acquire its reputation. The seances transformed the direction of the Borley story. What had begun as scattered reports of apparitions, footsteps, and moving objects was now developing into a complete supernatural narrative, populated by named spirits, hidden burials, and messages from the dead. It was an extraordinary evolution, but one that rested entirely upon information produced during automatic writing sessions, rather than upon documentary historical evidence. While these communications were taking shape in London, life at the rectory itself continued much as before. Observers still came and went, recording occasional sounds, isolated sightings and incidents that they found difficult to explain. Then during the closing months of 1938, Harry Price's tenancy came to an end. He handed the keys to a new owner. Within a few months, Borley Rectory would be gone forever. Captain William Gregson took possession of the rectory towards the end of 1938. He renamed the property Borley Priory and intended to restore the aging building. Local opinion was divided. Some believed he had purchased the house because of its notoriety, while others accepted that he simply saw potential in a large country property whose reputation had greatly reduced its value. Whatever his motives, he soon found himself living in one of the most famous houses in Britain. Gregson did not dismiss the stories that surrounded Borley. Before long, he too reported unusual experiences. He spoke of unexplained sounds within the house and claimed to have seen figures moving through rooms that appeared to be empty. Visitors also left with accounts of strange incidents, although, as before, many others experienced nothing beyond the ordinary creaks and noises expected from an aging Victorian building. The most dramatic event in the history of the rectory came shortly after midnight on the 27th of February, 1939. Fire broke out inside the building. Despite every effort to save it, the flames spread rapidly through the old timber structure. The house had no electricity, no modern fire protection, and no reliable water supply capable of dealing with a blaze of that size. By dawn, much of the rectory had been destroyed. Walls remained standing, but the roof had collapsed. Floors had fallen into the cellars, and decades of family life had disappeared beneath charred beams and broken brickwork. The cause of the fire has never been established with certainty. Captain Gregson maintained that he had accidentally overturned an oil lamp while unpacking books in the library. Others suspected the explanation was less straightforward. Rumours of deliberate arson circulated almost immediately, some suggesting that the house had been insured for more than it was worth. No conclusive evidence was ever produced, and no criminal proceedings followed. The fire remains one of the unresolved episodes in the history of Borley. Even as the building burned, new stories began to emerge. Some people watching the fire claimed they could see figures moving behind the blazing windows. One report described a woman standing at an upstairs window before disappearing into the smoke. Another witness believed they had seen a shadow crossing one of the upper rooms after the roof had already begun to collapse. None of these accounts can now be verified, but they entered the growing legend almost immediately and have been repeated ever since. The destruction of the rectory might easily have marked the end of the Borley story. Instead, it ensured its survival. The roof had gone, the rooms were exposed to the weather, and the house was no longer habitable. Yet the ruined shell attracted more visitors than ever before. Curious sightseers wandered among the fallen bricks. Investigators searched the blackened cellars, and spiritualists continued to hold seances within the ruins. Borley had ceased to be simply a haunted house. It had become a place of pilgrimage. Harry Price was determined that the story should not end with the fire. If anything, he believed the destruction of the building offered one final opportunity to answer the mystery that had come to dominate the legend. Hidden somewhere beneath the shattered floors, according to the planchette communications received only months earlier, lay the remains of the mysterious woman known as Marie Lair. In 1943, with permission to excavate the ruins, Price assembled a small party and returned to Borley once again. It would become the most famous excavation in British paranormal history.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
By the time Harry Price returned to Borley, 4 years had passed since the fire. The rectory stood roofless against the Essex sky, its walls blackened by smoke and slowly yielding to the weather. Floors had collapsed into the cellars. Ivy had begun creeping across the brickwork, and the gardens, once carefully maintained by the Bull family, had become overgrown. Even in ruin, the building retained an unmistakable presence. Visitors continued to arrive, picking their way across broken masonry in search of the place that had dominated newspaper headlines for more than a decade. Price had come with a specific purpose. The planchette communications received during the Streatham seances had claimed that the body of Marie Lair lay buried beneath an earlier structure on the site. If any human remains could be found beneath the cellars, he believed they might finally provide physical evidence linking the legend to the history of the rectory. Excavation began within the ruined cellar, beneath what had once been part of the house. Joining Price were several supporters, including the Reverend John Denning, together with lawyers, medical men, and other witnesses. The presence of respectable observers was intended to demonstrate that the work was being conducted openly and carefully. Every discovery attracted close attention, not least because newspapers were already following developments with considerable interest. During the dig, fragments of human bone were recovered from beneath a concrete well tank. Price regarded the discovery as the climax of the entire Borley investigation. The remains were immediately linked with Marie Lair, the supposed French nun whose story had emerged from the planchette sessions 6 years earlier. For many readers of his later book, this seemed to provide remarkable confirmation that the communications had described a real historical event. Later examination reached a rather different conclusion. Archaeologists and later investigators pointed out that the bones were incomplete, had not been recovered from an undisturbed burial, and possessed no archaeological context capable of identifying who the individual had been or when they had died. There was nothing to connect them with a 17th century French nun, or indeed with Borley itself. Human remains are not uncommon discoveries on sites occupied by many centuries, particularly close to parish churches, and no evidence emerged linking these bones with the elaborate story produced during the seances. Despite those reservations, the remains were treated with respect. In May 1945, they were buried in the churchyard at nearby Liston after a Christian service. For those who believed the Borley legend, it represented the final act in a tragedy that had supposedly begun centuries before. For others, it marked the burial of unidentified human remains, whose true history had been lost long before the rectory was built. Price's second book, The End of Borley Rectory, appeared the following year. It brought together the excavation, the seances, the wall writings, and the reports gathered over almost 20 years into a single narrative. The book proved enormously successful, cementing Borley's reputation in the public imagination and ensuring that the ruined rectory would remain Britain's most famous haunted house long after the building itself had disappeared. Not everyone accepted Price's conclusions. Within months of publication, criticism began to appear from people who had known the case almost as well as he had. Some questioned his interpretation of the evidence. Others challenged individual incidents described in his books. A few went much further, arguing that parts of the Borley story had been exaggerated from the very beginning. The most searching examination of the entire affair was still to come. It would not be carried out by newspaper reporters or enthusiastic ghost hunters, but by investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, who returned to the witnesses themselves and began asking a simple question: what had really happened at Borley Rectory? The investigation eventually produced one of the most influential books ever written about a haunting. Published in 1956, The Haunting of Borley Rectory, a critical survey of the evidence, was written by Eric Dingwall, Kathleen Goldney, and Trevor H. Hall, after years of examining Price's surviving papers, correspondence, witness statements, and unpublished material. Rather than relying on the dramatic narrative presented in Price's books, they returned to the original evidence wherever possible. Their approach was methodical. They interviewed surviving witnesses, compared different versions of events, examined official records, and searched for explanations that had either been overlooked or omitted altogether. One of the first conclusions they reached concerned the legends themselves. The famous story of the medieval monk and nun, repeated countless times in newspapers and later books, could not be supported by historical evidence. Correspondence with the Essex Archaeological Society confirmed that no monastery had ever stood on the site of Borley Rectory, and there was equally little evidence for the supposed nunnery at nearby Bures that formed such an important part of the tale. Price himself eventually accepted this, although only after many years of repeating the story in lectures and publications. The investigators argued that the legend had become so firmly attached to Borley that later experiences were increasingly interpreted through it. The report also examined the way information spread between witnesses. By the late 1930s, almost everyone visiting Borley already knew the stories before they arrived. Price's own instruction booklet, given to members of his observation rota, described the sounds, apparitions, bells, footsteps, perfumes, and moving objects they might encounter. Dingwall and his colleagues believed this created a powerful atmosphere of expectation. Ordinary sounds in an unfamiliar Victorian house could easily acquire unusual significance when visitors had already been told precisely what they might hear. The famous wall writings received similar scrutiny. Contemporary photographs showed many different pencil marks, scribbles, and messages covering the walls. Price frequently treated new inscriptions as paranormal communications, yet systematic records were rarely kept. Some markings were photographed only after they had already been cleaned away, while others were simply assumed to be new because nobody remembered seeing them before. Later handwriting comparisons suggested that Marianne Foyster was responsible for many, if not all, of the messages. The report stopped short of claiming every inscription had been deliberately fabricated, but concluded there was no convincing evidence that any had appeared by paranormal means. The bells, which had become one of Borley's most celebrated mysteries, were examined in equally practical detail. Investigators discovered that the complicated bell system was capable of producing unexpected ringing through entirely ordinary cases. Loose wiring, vibration, mechanical faults, and interference could all affect individual bells, while some witnesses believed deliberate interference by practical jokers accounted for more dramatic episodes. Marianne Foyster's own son later described discovering how multiple bells could be made to ring together, suggesting that at least some of the spectacular incidents required no supernatural explanation. Attention also turned towards the house itself. Borley Rectory had always been an awkward building. It was large, poorly heated, full of drafts, surrounded by farm buildings, and connected by narrow passages and enclosed courtyards that carried sound remarkably well. Later visitors noticed how footsteps in the neighbouring cottage could seem to originate inside the rectory itself, while climbing roses striking brickwork produced regular knocking sounds during windy weather. Rats, mice, birds, and cats all found easy access to the building, and observers repeatedly mentioned how easily sounds echoed through its unusual layout. None of this explained every report, but it demonstrated how readily an old country house could produce unexplained noises without invoking anything paranormal. The report was equally critical of Harry Price's methods. It argued that incidents supporting the haunting were often emphasized, while statements that contradicted the supernatural narrative received little attention or were omitted altogether. Witnesses who experienced nothing unusual were largely absent from the published books, despite several later stating that their stays at Borley had been entirely uneventful. Dingwall, Goldie and Hall concluded that Price had not carried out the balanced investigation that such an extraordinary case required. Whether through enthusiasm, carelessness, or a desire to tell a compelling story, they believed he had gradually transformed a collection of uncertain incidents into what appeared to be a coherent supernatural case. The publication divided opinion almost as sharply as Price's own books had done. Supporters regarded it as the most thorough examination ever undertaken of Borley Rectory, while believers argued that the authors had become too sceptical, dismissing experiences that genuine witnesses believed they had encountered. More than 70 years later, that disagreement has never entirely disappeared. Borley remains one of the few haunted locations where both the haunting itself and the investigation into the haunting had become equally famous. One question still remained. If Harry Price had exaggerated evidence, if some witnesses had mistaken ordinary events for extraordinary ones, and if Marianne Foyster had almost certainly been responsible for many of the war writings, what, if anything, genuinely happened at Borley Rectory? That question is much harder to answer than either believers or skeptics sometimes suggest. Even the authors of the Society for Psychical Research report did not claim to have explained every account. Their criticism was directed primarily at the way the evidence had been presented, rather than insisting that every experience had an obvious solution. Some witnesses remained consistent throughout their lives. Others admitted they could no longer trust memories formed decades earlier. A number of stories collapsed completely under investigation, while a smaller number resisted any firm conclusion simply because too little reliable evidence survived. The figure of the nun remains the best example. Reports of a dark-veiled woman walking along the path beside the rectory were repeated over several decades by different witnesses. Yet every sighting occurred at a considerable distance, usually during poor light, and no contemporary written accounts survive from the earliest observations. The famous sighting by the Bull sisters in 1900 was only recorded many years afterwards. Whether they saw a real person, an illusion created by fading light, or something genuinely unexplained, can no longer be established with certainty. The phantom coach suffers from similar difficulties. Several witnesses claim to have heard or seen a horse-drawn carriage moving near the rectory, despite there being no visible vehicle. Yet Borley lay on country roads that had carried horse traffic for generations, and sound travelled remarkably well across the valley below. Contemporary descriptions also vary considerably. Some speak only of hearing wheels. Others describe a complete coach, while later versions introduce details that earlier witnesses had never mentioned. Like so much else connected with Borley, the story became richer with every retelling. Even the famous fire of 1939 acquired its own folklore almost immediately. As flames consumed the empty building, stories appeared claiming that strange figures had been seen walking inside the burning rectory. Newspapers repeated the reports eagerly, adding another dramatic chapter to Borley's growing reputation. No photographs confirm these claims, and eyewitness descriptions differ significantly, yet the fire itself became inseparable from the legend. The destruction of the house ensured that the place could never again be examined exactly as it had stood during the years of the alleged hauntings. When the remaining ruins were finally demolished in 1944, many assumed the story would gradually disappear. Instead, the opposite happened. Visitors continued travelling to the site. Seances were held among the remaining foundations. Local people reported occasional apparitions. Others claimed to hear footsteps or see lights where the rectory had once stood. Harry Price himself returned to excavate beneath the cellars, where human bones were discovered. They were widely reported as the remains of the legendary nun, although archaeological opinion suggested they were far more likely to be ordinary historic burials. No proven connection to any of the legends surrounding Borley. Even so, the bones were eventually buried in the churchyard nearby, adding yet another layer to the story. By then, Borley Rectory had become something larger than the house itself. It had become a legend sustained by books, newspaper reports, radio broadcasts, investigations, arguments and personal belief. The building had vanished, but the story had acquired a life entirely independent of the place where it began. Few haunted locations have generated quite so much debate, not simply over whether ghosts existed there, but over how ghost stories themselves are created, repeated, and transformed across generations. Borley Rectory no longer stands. The great Victorian house that once overlooked the Stour Valley disappeared decades ago, demolished after the fire and the subsequent clearance of the site. Today there is remarkably little to suggest that this quiet corner of North Essex was once at the centre of the most famous haunting in Britain. St Mary's Church still stands beside the lane. The surrounding fields remain largely unchanged. The farmhouse and the neighbouring cottages survive, and the landscape still carries the same sense of isolation that so many visitors remarked upon during the 20th century. It is a peaceful place, and without knowing its history, there would be little to distinguish it from countless other rural parishes across England. What survives instead is an extraordinary archive. Thousands of pages of letters, notebooks, witness statements, newspaper reports, photographs, and books preserve almost every stage of the Borley story. Few alleged hauntings have generated such an extensive body of evidence, and fewer still have been examined from so many different perspectives. Historians, psychical researchers, skeptics, and believers have all returned to the same collection of documents, often reaching very different conclusions. Whether Borley Rectory was genuinely haunted is something each listener must decide for themselves. Some reports remain difficult to account for with complete confidence. Others become far less mysterious when examined alongside contemporary records and the testimony of later investigators. What began as a series of ghost stories attached to a Victorian rectory gradually became something much larger. It became a study of memory, expectation, folklore, journalism, psychical research, and the powerful influence of belief itself. The haunting and the investigation eventually became inseparable, each shaping the other until the story assumed a life of its own. Nearly a century after the first newspaper headlines appeared, people still visit Borley. They pause beside the church, look across the ground where the rectory once stood, and reflect on the events that transformed an isolated country parish into one of the most discussed locations in paranormal history. The questions raised there have never been fully settled, and that may explain why the story continues to endure. Borley is no longer simply remembered as England's most haunted house. It has become one of the most important and thoroughly documented ghost stories ever recorded, inviting every new generation to examine the evidence and reach its own conclusion. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the podcast and get access to MP3s over on Buy Me a Coffee. They're £1.50 each, or free if you're a subscriber. You can find everything at ghosttales.co.uk and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Ghost Tales Podcast.